So another aspect of the strategic farm here in the east was looking at flowering margins around fields and their role within integrated pest management, provision of pollen for pollinators, and all the beneficials that we really need to start learning and understanding more as farmers. So we've taken 3 fields in the same rotation across the farm. One field has been described as business as usual, so we've done nothing other than farm it in the same way as we would have done. And then we've got 2 other fields, one which is this field, which has got a 6-metre flowering margin all the way around the outside, and then there's a strip in the middle which is 100 metres away from either side, which falls directly in line with where our tram lines are. So it doesn't really alter it, it just takes a little bit more land out of production, but then we're going to have a flowering margin up the middle of our field. And the other field just has the 6-metre flowering margin around the outside. So this is very similar to the Assist project, and we're sort of looking at it and how we can sort of see the benefits. Is there going to be encroachment of pests off this margin, or are we going to see the beneficials working their way into the field, and meaning that we're not going to have to apply any more insecticides or change our farming system to it? The flowering margin was established in the spring. It was very dry when we did it, and we were a bit worried that we had put very expensive seed in the ground and we hadn't seen any benefit. But now we're starting to see a really diverse mix of species. You can see the yarrow, oxeye daisies, some muskmelio, and different species coming out. There's a lot of ryegrass in here. That was because it was into a ryegrass stubble, and so that might cause a problem later on. We've topped it several times to try and get rid of the thistles that came initially, but there's still quite a few boar thistles which we're going to have to sort of take out with spot treatment later in the season. So going forward, we're going to top it quite hard to make sure that the thistles don't come back, and then we're going to let it go into the spring and let it flower in full effect. So we'll be looking at this as a long-term demonstration of how we can sort of integrate flowering margins into our farmed ecosystem and see what the benefit is to the beneficial insects and any link to pests and enemies being eaten by those beneficials, and the role within the pollinators, which we know are so important in the farmed ecosystem. So we're going to be looking at the actual finances of this, how much it actually costs to take this land out of production. Obviously we're taking an area out of production that's not going to have any crop, and is that going to be enough payback from the beneficials and the pollinators going forward? This is going to be run for the next 3 years of the strategic farm, hopefully.
Harvest year 2020, AHDB started a series of pest and natural enemies monitoring. So for the pests, we were monitoring aphid numbers and slugs, and for the natural enemies we were doing a series of pitfalling traps. We're doing this across the farm to take account landscape variabilities, and we're also doing it within the flowering strips, where flowering strips have been established, to look at what the impact on providing this resource is onto the diversity of natural enemies. So the strip behind me was established in September this year, whereas this one around the margins was established in June. So we'll have a good contrast there at looking at the different development stages on the diversity. This work is then going to be repeated at Strategic Farm West and Strategic Farm Scotland. So we'll be building up a database across the different strategic farms. And all the methods that we are trialling are things that farmers will be able to do themselves, and they'll be able to assess what resources that they need and can introduce into the field to boost natural enemy numbers.
A big area for me this autumn is the risk of BYDV, and these flowering strips and this demonstration is going to be a really interesting one to follow with that in mind, because the aphid green bridge, which is talked about, but then we've also need to understand the natural beneficials that are actually predating those aphids across the farm. So hoverfly larvae, ladybirds, parasitic wasps, these will all be aimed and looked at within these flowering margins. And if they can stop the early infection of the aphids coming into the field, and if they can stop them spreading into our crops as they come up and establish through the early part of the autumn, then these are going to be valuable assets that we need to invest in on our farm. And this is why the research on farm, looking at a landscape scale, is completely required and demanded by farmers to understand what's going on in the farm landscape. And so BYDV for me is a concern, and we need to be looking at natural ways instead of going to the can and everything else like that. The AHDB on their website have got a very good interactive BYDV management tool, which is what I'm using to manage the risks of BYDV going forward. There's also other trials being done on the farm looking at aphid numbers with BYDV in mind, and this is all research that we need to get more research onto farms, and which will then look at being rolled out across the country, and more data is always going to help with these new risks that we've got to sort of associate with aphids going forward with the loss of insecticides.
The other trial, which will carry over from year 1 and will go all the way through the 6 years, is a flowering margin trial. So we're looking at the impact of having flowering margins around the edge of the fields, but also every 100 metres within a field. We're looking at using no insecticides on those crops all the way through the 6 years, and trying to evaluate the impact of the beneficial insects within those margins across the crop.